Well, thanks and good evening. Thank you for the invitation. And it's good to be here for the first time, but I see one or two familiar faces in the audience. So that's good. But as you've heard, I mean, you may have heard of me before. I wear a number of hats, as I was saying earlier. I'm on the RSGB board at the moment and will be until the end of next year. So if you do have any RSGB questions, you can ask me afterwards. I don't promise to answer them. I'm also, until the end of this year, chairman of the contest committee. That's something I've been doing. It's supposed to be a temporary thing while I sorted out a few problems, but it's been temporary for 3 years now. But I'm also involved, yes, in writing a column in Ragcom, and yes, I've written a couple of books, and yes, I'm involved in organising various expeditions and going on various contest expeditions as well, some of which we'll cover this evening. The topic is fairly generic. I mean, the topic I've worked up with Derek was World of DX, which can mean just about anything. And that gives me a chance to cover a whole variety of different stuff. I don't know what you're interested in. I hope you'll find it interesting, some of it, and we can pick up at the end through questions of particular areas, because the sort of thing I want to cover is, what is DX, a little bit of history, maybe some operating advice about station choice, talk a little bit about awards and QSLing, maybe what the future holds. Fairly generic, a little bit anecdotal. The picture at the beginning, by the way, let me just go back to that for a moment. That's probably what you imagine DX is like, that's why we get into this, because you sit in your little shack at home and it's raining outside and you think this person I'm talking to is on a little desert island. And indeed, that's one of the little desert islands we operated from, and it was very nice too, but they're not all like that. Some of them are snowbound and have other problems. And that actually takes us on to the subject of what is DXing. How many of you think of yourselves as DXers to a lesser or greater degree? 2 or 3 of you, the rest maybe not so. How many of you are active on HF? One way, mostly, a lot of you one way or another, but not all as DX chasers. Probably think it's only for those with big stations, big linears or whatever. Maybe I'll disillusion you about that as the evening goes on. For a lot of us, it's about chasing countries. They're the obvious counters. Talking to somebody in some rare spot at the other side of the world. But it doesn't have to be. But there's certainly plenty of awards that we chase if we do. There's the 5-band DXCC, which came in quite a few years ago. 100 countries on each of the main 5 bands, 10, 15, 20, 40 and 80. That did a lot to stimulate DXing on the 40 and 80 metre bands, which is more challenging than on, say, 20 or 15. Now there's the DeSoto Cup and the DXCC Challenge, and that's for 10 bands, 160 through to 6 metres, and they add up the countries that you've contacted on each of those, and the people at the top of that are up around the 3,000 mark. They're 300 countries on pretty much every band, and probably 150 or so on 6 metres. And the leading station each year in that challenge, and it's usually in America, though it's moved to Europe recently, gets the DeSoto Cup. But that really is the pinnacle. And my view of that, and indeed the people who are at the top of the IOTA, the islands on the air listings, is that they're actually a sad bunch because they never go on holiday and they spend all their time on the radio chasing other people. I've actually got to the point where I enjoy more being at the other end, going out to interesting places and activating places. But that means I miss things in the process. 5-band works all zones. Zones are another thing that people chase. CQ magazine decided that if the ARRL had the DXCC award, and that was introduced in 1935, they had to have something to compete with it. So they divided the world up into 40 zones. And that spawned a whole series of awards based on that, and that's pretty challenging too. And IOTA is our homegrown RSGB one, chasing islands around the world as against countries or zones. And then there are some people like to do things on an annual basis, and I'm sure that I run in-year tables within my column in RAGCOM, and people get enthusiastic about that. And it gives you an idea of what can be done within a 12-month period. Because DXing is actually like contesting, only it's a very long contest. It lasts all your life rather than 12 hours or 24 hours or whatever. And one of the reasons that some of us are doing quite well at this challenge is not because we've got particularly special stations, but because we've got grey hair or not much of it anymore, and we've been doing this for a long time. So on the high bands, pretty much anything outside Europe or North America would count as DX. It's not to do with distance as such on 20 metres. I mean, you hear G stations working Australia and New Zealand every morning. It really isn't difficult. In fact, that's quite an easy path, long path there. And with a dipole and 100 watts, you can do that pretty much any time. So there are other reasons why something would be rare, and we'll talk about that. On the low bands, it's probably anything outside Europe, but again, it depends on what your station is like. And on VHF, and even on the higher HF bands, DX can be taking advantage of unusual propagation. 2 metres, you can only talk to your mate down the road most of the time, but then you get a tropo opening and you can talk to somebody at the other end of Europe. And 6 metres is particularly interesting, as I'm sure you know, that when you get sporadic E, you get multi-hop in the summer, and pretty much every summer we can talk to the States on 6 metres, usually around about midnight and usually around about the first week of July, at a time when the HF bands are completely dead, and that's absolutely fascinating. I find 6 metres quite interesting, and my most recent book is about 6 metre operating. You've probably seen it advertised. But what makes things rare are different reasons, and I've given some examples here. SV/A, Mount Athos, little monastery community on a peninsula off Greece, or on Greece, but a little mountain peninsula. Only males allowed there, and only under very strict regulation. There is one of the monks who happens to be licensed, a guy called Apollo, and he's basically the only person to operate from there. There have been a couple of visitors that he's managed to get in, radio amateurs from elsewhere, from Germany on one occasion. I don't know how they get in, whether they have to sign up to that monastic order for the week or whatever. That's what makes that place rare. Whereas BS7, Scarborough Reef, is just a rock, or pretty much a rock, off China, but it's far enough away from China under the rules that the ARRL have for this award that it counts separately. And that's a very interesting one, because not the last operation, but the one before that came to a fairly abrupt end, because the ownership of Scarborough Reef is disputed. The Philippines lay claim to it, and they sent a gunship, and the Chinese sent a gunship to counter this, and it all got a little bit hairy for a while. Recent operation from Desecheo Island was a first for many years. Desecheo Island is all of about a 10-minute helicopter ride from the end of Puerto Rico. Why is it so rare? Because the Americans restrict access to it. Why do they restrict access to it? Well, it's basically there's unexploded ordnance on there because of things they've used the island for in the past, and B, it's a handy place for drug runners to use as a stopping off place across the Caribbean. So the Americans are a bit sensitive about who goes there. And this recent operation was very carefully controlled by the American authorities. They could only operate from a certain part of the island, and I think they had to be watched pretty much all of the time. 3Y1 or 3Y0, Peter, the first island, or Bouvet Islands, a couple of counters. These are Norwegian possessions almost down in the Antarctic. and just very expensive and very difficult to get to. There was an operation some years ago from the South Sandwich Islands, probably, I can't remember, it was one of the British possessions down there. The guys who went really did not take the right gear for that sort of climate, and they almost came a cropper. The guys who went to Peter I the other year did it properly. They chartered a big vessel that was geared up for the Antarctic. It had the right sort of helicopter and everything. That's not cheap, and these operations don't happen all that often. But why would anybody want to do this? Well, the challenge of making contact with these rare places, a touch of the exotic. You talk to anybody on the internet these days, on Skype, but to say over the radio that you've been talking to Tom Christian on Pitcairn Island, descendant of Fletcher Christian, just still has something of an appeal to it. There's just the competitive aspect of it, competing with your fellow hams, to get these awards and so on. And it's a reason to be on the bands. Heaven knows, a lot of people don't seem to have a reason to be on the bands these days. The bands can be very quiet during the week when there isn't an expedition going on. A little bit of activity still on 80 metres, the usual lumbago sufferer's net or whatever, but there isn't as much as activity as there was. And whether it's because people don't have as much time, or whether it's because they're using other technologies, whether PLT is putting them off the air, we don't know. And it's a motivator to develop the station, learn about propagation, develop operating skills. All this applies to contesting as well, of course, and many DXs are contesters and vice versa. As I said, a contest is just a very quick, controlled way of working the stuff that you would otherwise spend years doing. But I mean, if you go back, it was actually a way of keeping in touch. A lot of people, a lot of expats used amateur radio before IDD came along, and back in the early 80s, G3ZAY and I kept regular contact with VP8ANT, which was Richard G3CWI, who's now a great summit on the Airman. He was working down there with the British Antarctic Survey as a radio operator, and they didn't have sat phones and things then. They used radio in and out of that place. With some pretty big ROM mix, I have to say. It was quite easy to maintain. In 2 years, we never missed a sked with him, even when he was out on the ice on a little expedition and only had a backpack radio with him. We still managed to work him. It's a great way of making friends. I mean, again, when I started, we could talk to people in Russia at a time when the Iron Curtain was very firmly in place. Something unique about it. So what makes an entity, and do we actually care? And here's a few more odd ones. Well, there's BS7H, or BS7, Scarborough Reef. And that's one of the 3 rocks that you could actually big enough to put a platform on. But there again, the reef itself is quite large under the water, and the Chinese claim it because it gives them territorial rights around it for fishing and oil and whatever else they can find. This is an interesting one. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta counts as a separate DXCC entity, not country, we don't call them countries anymore, we call them entities. And the Military Order of Malta they were active during the Crusades, looking after knights who got injured and so on, and then they went to Cyprus, and then they got driven to Malta, where they were for a very long time. But now they're reduced to a villa in Rome, or just on the outskirts of Rome. So is a villa actually a country? Well, they still have diplomatic status in certain circles, as does the Vatican, which also counts as a separate one. What about this one? This came in as a new country a few years ago, or a new counter. Ducie Island, it belongs to Pitcairn, but is separate, it's quite some way from Pitcairn. And according to DXCC rules, it could become a new counter if Pitcairn had its own IARU National Society. The RSGB had always negotiated on behalf of Pitcairn, but Pitcairn set up a national society just in order to get around the ARRL rules. Ducie Island became a counter, and then the Pitcairn National Society asked the RSGB to continue negotiating on its behalf, as it couldn't actually send people to conferences. But anyway, we squeezed that one in. And it's been fun. There was one hell of an operation from there just the beginning of last year. Or was it the beginning of this year? I'm losing track. But you won't all start working stuff like that. You set goals. I'm going to chase an award, a basic 100 countries or 100 islands or whatever. Have a look at what you've got in the way of a radio and antennas. And I fight a battle against those people who say, I don't need a big Yagi on a tower, I've got a half-size G5RB and I can work all sorts of stuff with that. And I say, that's great, think how much more you could work if you had something a little bit more ambitious. But it's also about experience and technique. And there's a lot of people, you've only got to listen on the FT5GA expedition that's active at the moment, and you'll hear a lot of people, particularly from Italy and other places south, who are demonstrating how not to do it. And of course all this gives us an understanding of propagation. If somebody goes off to an island in the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean or whatever, you need to think about what frequency is most appropriate to contact them, what time of day, and so on. So it actually forces us to do what we're supposed to do as radio amateurs, which is self-training in the art of radio communication. Again, contesting even more so in a way, because you've got less time to think about it. You've really got to be on the ball with these things. What band should I be on now? Which way should I be beaming? What parts of the world am I expecting to hear and to work? You need sources of information in this day and age. Well, you always have. How do I know what to expect on the band? How do I know which expeditions are going to be active or who is living in some exotic place and quite active from there? And if you're serious about this, you probably want to collect QSL cards as well. There's a couple of faces. Whether any of you recognise either of those. Anybody want to volunteer in? You're nodding.
Danny Vile, one of them.
Danny Vile on the left. Anybody remember, anybody other than Ian, does the name ring a bell with anybody? Yeah. Some of the older ones among you. I'm actually post Danny Vile. I don't remember Danny being active, but a lot of us have heard of him. Because in a sense, he was one of the first de-expeditioners, and I'll talk a little bit more about him. These two gents are the only two UK hams, and Danny was British, although he never used the British call sign, who've been inducted to the CQ Magazine Hall of Fame. The other one wasn't even an amateur, he was a shortwave listener, Jeff Watts, who started the RSGB's DX news sheet and also founded the Islands on the Air award. Not many people have met him. I'm one who has, because Martin Atherton, G3XTT, and I took over the DX news sheet from Jeff when he decided he had to give it up when he was spending too much time looking after his wife, who had become very ill. And we went up to visit Jeff at his home and collected all the stuff from him. But he never got out much in his later years. So here are some of the people who went out and activated places. DX was partly, as I said before, people who were in interesting places for their work or posted overseas. A lot of interesting activity after the war. One of the first was a guy, AC4YN, a Brit who was in Tibet. And if you read his story, it's absolutely fascinating, because he was sent by the British across the Tibetan plateau with a lot of radio equipment to accompany a diplomatic expedition there. And And this, for this, there were huge, great radios, none of your small 817s and things there. They had to be carried by yak and camel or whatever across the mountains. Absolutely fascinating. And he did come on the amateur bands and make just a few contacts. And that was a very rare one. But then the time came when a few people said, well, there are places in the world that don't have resident radio amateurs. Let's go and operate from them and put them on the air for those who are chasing these different awards. And here were some of the early ones. Those two, anybody? Yeah. Don Miller and Gus Browning. Again from the 60s, very well known, a couple of Americans who went off around the world, sometimes together, sometimes apart. Don Miller was quite an interesting one. He apparently turned up from all sorts of rare places. It was reputed that he didn't always actually operate from the places he claimed to be at. But there you go.
Gus was a Coca-Cola salesman, wasn't he? Well, he wasn't a Coca-Cola salesman, but all his write-ups involved Coca-Cola.
That I didn't know, actually. Yeah. But Don was later indicted for murder and was in prison for a number of years, so that's the more exotic side of him. He murdered his wife or something. These two, the Colvins, Lloyd and Iris, or Floyd and Virus as some call it. Both passed away now, but he was a very senior officer in the military and then made a lot of money when he was demobbed, and they went off for about 6 months of each year under the auspices of the Yasmi Foundation. Yasmi was the name of Danny Wile's yacht. We'll come back to that as well. And then subsequently the Yasmi Foundation handled all the QSLing for Danny, but then for a number of others, including Lloyd and Iris. And they went off to a number of countries around the world over the years, and I do remember them operating, and I have been to some of the talks that they gave, which were generally extremely boring. But the classic one from Eritrea that they gave the DX dinner at Dayton. And they'd been billed for this because it was a rare place, but at the time Eritrea was still quite tense. There was a war with Ethiopia, and they were advised to stay inside their apartment block, which was rather dodgy. So all we got were photographs of the inside of the room and the inside of the bathroom and a view of the street from out of the window. But they certainly activated a number of places and kept a lot of people happy. Probably the best known one of all in this day and age. Are you the only one who knows who all these are? Marty Lane, OH2BH, who has been activating places since the 60s and is still at it, and just celebrated his 60th birthday. But he's been all over the world on expeditions. I don't know how he does it. So Danny was on from 54 to 63. Here's some of the places he operated from before his first yacht was sunk. And what happened was he got in touch with a guy called Dick Spenceley in the Virgin Islands. And I can't remember exactly what happened, but he was persuaded that he was going to sail around the world anyway, and Dick said, well, you need an amateur radio license, and you're going to make a lot of people happy, and if you do that, I'll raise some money to help fund your round the world sailing trips. That's basically what happened. He went off, did some operating from some of the Pacific Islands. That's the canal zone, so we obviously went through the Suez Canal and then off to Tahiti and various places around Australia, and then managed to lose his boat. So there was a big fundraising effort, and they got him another one, and he went off again. A number of Caribbean islands, St Kitts, Montserrat and so on, and they managed to sink another boat. And they got him another one, and off he went again and did some more operations, as you can see. So quite a story. He got through 4 boats, spending in today's money probably in excess of $1 million. And a typical stopover then generated about 2,000 to 3,000 contacts. Whereas an expedition these days, if it doesn't make 50 or 60,000 as a minimum, is regarded as a failure. But the ham radio world followed his travels, and they were absolutely fascinated by what he was up to. It's quite interesting. There's been a lot of stuff recently about, is it right for the expeditions to raise the amount of money they do? Here's a couple of quotes from Danny. You realise I want to be preferential to those hams who've subscribed. You know I can't sort them out of the QRM, so I suggest you arrange with your friends that I be available on a certain day. And I've managed to clear about 4 or 5 before everybody else comes and cuts his QRM. That was back in '56, and we think we've got a problem now. And there's very little else to say except a complaint. He says, W6AM, who was top of the honour roll for many, many, many years, Don Wallace, he and his mate decided they would hold me as long as possible in a contact. Now obviously what happened is they'd made contact with him from somewhere rare and they didn't want anybody else to get that one. The mere fact that I got the rest of the lads to call another frequency did not deter our 2 friends. Actually, the story of Don Wallace is absolutely fascinating. It's been published in a book by N6AW. Lots of old QSL cards and equipment. He was a travelling salesman on the west coast of the States and bought umpteen acres in the Palos Verdes Peninsula in California and had rhombics on there. Ran a hell of a lot of power, and when the FCC tried to indict him for running excess power, they couldn't prove that he was, because he had so many different rhombics and could steer the signal around that they couldn't prove what he was doing at the time. And the only DXCC counter he ever missed was when he was at the top of one of his towers sorting out one of his rhombics. And somebody called, phoned and said, "This is on," and his wife or somebody shouted up the tower, and he said, "Oh, I'll be finished in an hour and down." And by the time he'd got down, that was the end of that particular operation. He missed it. But the going rate for Danny's operation was about, it worked out about $1 a QSO, or in today's money about $10. So it's always cost money to send these people off. Perhaps it's not cricket, but I'm practically ignoring all other calls except the Americans. I can't see the point in using their money to contact other countries. Wonderful, wonderful. And as I said, Don Wallace, was he or wasn't he in these places? This set of rocks could have been the Peter and Paul rocks, or they could have been on the coast practically anywhere. However, he was a damn good operator. He could hear several calls in a pile-up and at one go, and then just work through them very, very quickly, as could Gus Browning. We've had a few others over the years. A chap called Romeo Stepanenko operated. It became very famous very quickly after the fall of the Iron Curtain by going off to a number of places. Democratic Republic of Korea, North Korea. Was he operating from there? Well, it turned out later he was in Russia, but very close to the North Korean border. The Myanmar expedition was an interesting one. There was a lot of people thought they weren't there, where they said in Burma. And eventually Romeo was disqualified from the DXCC program. It's very interesting when he came to the UK for the first time, and he was met at the airport, and we feted him with the Chiltern DX Club because he was very well known and been on these operations, which at that time there was no question mark over. And his English was very good until you asked him exactly where they were and how they got permission, and then suddenly he couldn't understand you anymore. But Gus survived intact, and for a long time he published something called the DXers magazine, and basically the funds from that helped to keep him going around the world. Some interesting ones here. some quite rare spots. Tibet doesn't count as a separate country anymore, of course, because it's part of China these days. Yes. And of course, if you look back, I mean, as I said, you know, expats in some interesting places. There was a time when countries like Åland Islands, or even the Balearics, or Liechtenstein were quite rare, but African countries and Asian countries were on the lands daily, 5A. Libya was on all the time. There were Brits out there still with the forces after the war. Yemen, 4Ws used nowadays for somewhere completely different. YA0CDRC was on the bands every day. The Camel Drivers Radio Club in Afghanistan. I remember hearing that. And ET3 USA in Ethiopia was a big US operation there. And I remember that being very, very active. And just as an example, I mean, Colin, G3PSN, who's the current president of the RSGB, held some of these calls when he was in the RAF. Malta, the States, Gibraltar, Libya, Cyprus, Germany, Bahrain, MP4N, Muscat, Qatar, Trucial States, and this would have been Gan in the Indian Ocean, and then Cyprus again, but British bases, all in the 60s, and there were a lot of people like that. Of course, the end of amateur radio as we know it has always been nigh, and these just amuse me, so, because you still hear it now about the internet. Artificial aerial licenses are no more. Amateur radio will never be the same. That was good old Austin Forsyth writing in Shortwave Mag. A year's apprenticeship on CW is no longer required. Amateur radio will never be the same again. SSB, it was coming in quite strongly when I was first licensed, but AN was still the place to be. Then CBers, novice license, etc., etc. But we still enjoy the chase. There's certainly been some high drama over the years. In 1966, a couple of people were lost at sea en route to Wallace, and from Wallace to Western Samoa. I remember in 1983 some Germans going to the Spratly Islands, and a number of the Spratlys, which are disputed between China, the Philippines, Malaysia, and most of the countries around there, and occupied by pirates, and I think that's still the case, because we hear of pirates getting onto ships not just off Somalia, but also in the South China Seas. And these pirates fired at these Germans who were approaching Amboina Cay, where they were going to operate from, and 2 of them died, 2 survived. I've talked about what happened with Scarborough Reef. When Boris Yeltsin occupied the White House, as in the one in Moscow, the only communications out for a while were via amateur radio. The Falklands, as you'll remember, the only communications out when the Argentinians invaded was amateur radio. I remember hearing about the American invasion of Grenada an hour or 2 before it was on the news, because I heard somebody talking about it on 20 meters. I thought I'd just mention achievement levels, because these have changed over the years, and these are a couple of tables going back. At one of our club junk sales, I picked up a lot of old shortwave mags from the 50s and 60s. And here we see G2DC was at the top with 331 countries. And in an annual table, a 5-band table, G3UML, Laurie, who's still active at 196. And this is broken down by band, but only 35 on 80 meters. That would be pretty poor show these days, but there wasn't then this interest in DX on 80. It wasn't considered a DX band. And his father, G3NMH, at number 2. And a number of these guys are still very active now. Which takes us on to what sort of station do you need to work DX. And DXing used to be, back then, in that era, it was sort of the wealthy who did well. There wasn't a lot of equipment available back in the 50s and 60s. A lot of it was government surplus, an old HRO receiver maybe, that has come onto the market after the war, and you build your own transmitter. There certainly weren't any Japanese black boxes until the late 60s, early 70s. There were Collins equipment and Drake line from the States, but very, very expensive. And I remember when I was living in Northampton and first licensed, there was one guy locally who had a set of Collins equipment and a 4-element 20-metre Yagi on his roof, only about half a mile from where I lived. But I never met him. I mean, he was in one of these big houses with big gates at the front, and obviously somebody of substance. And Laurie Margolis, G3UML, who I've just mentioned, talks about the Hams, the DXers in London, where he lived with his parents, used to have black tie dinners at the Savoy and this sort of thing. It was out of reach of the majority. Now that's not the case these days, at least money-wise it shouldn't be. Most transceivers can work split, they've got good filters, they're excellent from a technical point of view. Things have come on a long way. But you do need a reasonable antenna out in the clear, and that's where a lot of us struggle because of the concerns about outside antennas, and a lot of that's being brought on because of the cellular thing, and people panic. We're talking about antennas. You need a little bit of test equipment, but mainly to do with checking out the antenna. And I would suggest these days, if you're serious, you need a PC in the shack. But then most of us have that anyway. There are people who still log on this stuff. I don't know why you would do that, but it is rumoured that people still log on paper. I haven't done that for 20 years or more, I don't think.
Well, there's no batteries to run out.
Just going back, I mean, G2DC, you'll remember, was at the top of that list. Here was this. They used to have this wonderful feature in Shortwave Mag each month of the other man's station. I mean, we don't do this anymore, which is a shame, because I used to find them fascinating. But he had this big quad, and there's an AR88, and that looks like a T1154 transmitter, the sort that they used in Lancasters, and came onto the surplus market in great numbers after the war. So that's what it took to be a top DXer back there. This is some old pictures of my station, just to amuse you. Back in '73 or thereabouts, a couple of general coverage receivers, a Heathkit AM CW transmitter, which weighed an absolute ton. And then my first transceiver, an FT101 Mark 1. Absolute rubbish. Awful. There's a line or two there as well. If equally awful. Yeah. The best thing that, and that's a 4-metre transverter sitting on top of the 101. It took its high voltage from the 101, which had transverter output.
There's a Class D wave meter there.
There's a Class D wave meter. There's an AR77, which was a commercial receiver sold after the war, based on a stripped down AR88, if you like. Not very good. But the best thing that ever happened to the 101 Mark 1 was when I blew up the front end of it, and suddenly it worked a lot better on receive, because it just kept cross-modulating before, whereas once the front end amplifier had gone, it didn't cross-modulate so much. This is more recent. I mean, we've come on since then, but you get the idea, a PC and FT1000D and so on. So what do you need to work DX? Well, again, if you've been around in the 60s or 70s, you knew the answer. You bought a joystick. And that's produced a few wry smiles. They did a, what was it, 1,000,000 miles per watt certificate for joystick owners who'd managed to you know, work 1,000 miles with a milliwatt or something. And it clearly was you know, very attractive because he came with one of these nice young ladies. In practice, of course, you know, the antenna is everything when you're working DX or trying to maintain schedules with a friend in America or whatever. And the classic is some sort of 3-element tribander. That's not. That's a 3-element monobander. But you know, most people start with something like that. I started, my first gain antenna was a quad for 10 meters. That was back in 1970. Trying to think, 73. And you know, we had some sunspots then. So 10 meters was quite good, and I built a quad out of some garden canes and some bits of wire. It cost me about £2, I think, and it just transformed my life from a DXing point of view. Here's something a little bit more substantial. I think that's a C3XR. It's one of the big Force 12 antennas anyway. But there's lots of nice HF antennas around. But for the low bands, most people still rely on bits of wire. But you do have to think fairly seriously. But when we've been on our expeditions to the Indian Ocean, and we've generally done a pre-expedition write-up and said, if you want to work, this is what you need to do. Think about what band is going to be best. I remember for one of the expeditions, we said 17 meters, and make this sloping dipole, hang it from your chimney, it's not going to offend the neighbours, point it towards where we are, and that's going to be the best band for us, and you'll have a little bit of directivity and so on. And the number of people who called us and worked us and were delighted, and they said, oh, we're using G3NUG's antenna, and we said, no, he didn't invent the dipole, it's been around for a long time. But it's designed as a resonant antenna on a band, and if you have it sloping the right way, you get a bit of gain. Whereas a half-size G5RV or whatever,
That's good as your 101.
it's the antenna equivalent of the 101, yeah, that's right. A G5RV antenna, in case you didn't know, was designed by G5RV as an antenna for 80, 40, 20 and 10 meters. Doubling in frequency, halving in wavelength, and it was designed to present something around 50 ohms at the transmitter. But it wasn't 50 ohms, it was very reactive. But valve transmitters usually had a pi output stage that could cope with this. Solid state radios can't, they hate it. It was also before we had 15 meters. Gosh. Well before we had the walk bands, so the impedance it presents on those bands, God knows what it's like. So most people use them with an antenna tuner, and then it's no longer really a G5RV, it's a tuned doublet. But one of the things that's made DXing easier in a way is that the stations at the other end have got more ambitious. You know, when Danny and Gus and people were going around the world, they were, you know, they would string up a wire in a coconut tree, get one of the natives to climb up the tree, and maybe using 100 watts or something, and they would come on and they would make their 2,000 or 3,000 contacts with people back in the States, like W6AM, who had a big rhombex. On our expeditions, we've tried, and I say our, this is a 5-star DX association as we style ourselves these days, we've tried to do it the other way around, take a lot of kit so that we can contact even the weakest guys. And here's our 80-meter 4-square in Rodrigues, and some of the monoband Yagis on 40-foot masts at the back there, and we're very close to the water, so that we're quite loud. Here's another station I've operated from. It's essentially a contest station. That's HC8N in the Galapagos. And I was invited there for CQ Worldwide CW one year, and I was the 80-meter operator. What you've got there, this is The island, San Cristobal, is basically an extinct volcano, and the town is down by the water on the south side of the island. It's absolutely the wrong place to work the States or Europe. So N5KO and a couple of friends bought some land right on 40 acres right on top of the island, permanently in cloud, or almost permanently in cloud, whereas it's sunny down at the coast. But it's right on top of the island, the ground falls away towards the ocean. They put up 4 135-foot towers with a number of monobandas on each. One's for 40, one's for 20, one's for 15, one's for 10. And on 80, for example, which I was operating, we had a 2-element wire beam between two of those towers at the 135-foot level. That was awesome, working the States and Europe, and really, people have discovered working this station that when Galapagos at one time would have been considered quite a tough one. It's absolutely trivial now to contact them because they're doing all the work. It's a hell of a station and a hell of a location. There's a group of us who complete nutcases who go off to West Africa most years for these November contests. And there's been kit sitting out there in West Africa for about the last 15 years, and every couple of years we move on somewhere different. And each year we get it out of storage and put it up. And this was in Burkina Faso. We were XT2DX. The kit had been the year before in Ghana. And so we flew into Ghana, we put all this in a bus, drove it a day and a half to Ouagadougou, and stayed at the Hotel Splendide in Ouagadougou, put the antennas on the roof, monobandas, and off we went and had a great time. Did that 2 years, then moved to Niamey in Niger, and then they moved to Mali for 2 years. I didn't join them there, but I did join them last year in Guinea, and this year they'll be in Sierra Leone.
It's a voodoo contest.
This is the voodoo contest group, yeah. CW nutcases, and we go off and we do this each year. And again, it makes it easy because we're doing a lot of the work. But it's good fun, and interestingly in Africa, they love you. You try and do that in a hotel in the UK. There they put up a big sign in the lobby in French, the Hotel Splendide welcomes the voodoo contest group. It was wonderful. And the only problem we had was the lift motor put out a hell of a lot of QRN. And every time somebody used the lift, the bands just were almost... But other things have happened in the DX world. CEPT has made licensing so much easier. There's many countries you can go to with your UK license now and operate without any problems at all, because they've signed the agreement. Not just in Europe. It applies to French possessions in the Caribbean and the Pacific, for example. There's less fear of amateur radio. A lot of countries were paranoid about it, spies and all that. But now with the internet, everybody can talk to everybody else anyway, so amateur radio is not really relevant anymore. International travel is easier, especially with smaller radios. Well, it was until 9/11. It's getting harder. That's because of sensitivities about kit and so on, and it's also harder when Ryanair insist on charging you an arm and a leg for taking anything other than the smallest carry-on bag. But I remember one year going down to West Africa with the Voodoo guys, and I took the transformer for one of the linear amplifiers, and that was for a 10-tech Titan amplifier, and the transformer was about yay big and weighed heaven knows what. And I took it in a computer bag, and nobody took a blind bit of notice until I put it through the X-ray machine, and it didn't look like a computer. And the young lady said, "What's this?" And she couldn't pick it up. That was quite entertaining. People have greater disposable income and get around the world more and do stuff. There's more to chase in terms of the awards that are available. And there are DX foundations now which will sponsor expeditions, not pay for your holiday, but pay some of the radio-related costs. The Northern Cal DX Foundation Here we have the Chimp DX Club, the GM DX Club. In Europe, they have the European DX Foundation. So there's more activity on the bands. Every day you'll hear small expeditions. It gets pretty awful when there's something like Glorioso on at the moment. But there's people on from Africa or the Caribbean every day of the week, and yeah, it's quite fun to contact them. Go into dinner in the evening and say to your wife, "Oh, I've just been chatting to somebody in the Caribbean," or whatever. Incidentally, Roger G3XTT, who's one of the founders of the Voodoo Contest group, has written a number of books. He goes off, or has been off with G3TXF over the years to the Pacific and lots of other places. Wrote a book, Adventures of an Expeditioner. DX Delights, Travels with My Radio. But lately he's gone for what he calls micro-expeditioning, which is basically the Ryanair thing. You take an 817 or something similar on a Ryanair trip. The idea is don't pay more than 50 quid for your flight. Take everything as hand luggage, operate from a beach somewhere at the other end, and then catch the next flight back and just say you've done it. Takes all sorts. So, talked about countries. I mean, we have our own homegrown one. This was the Jeff Watts Islands on the Air thing, and has grown from a modest start to being probably the second biggest DX program in the world. And lots of things count. You don't have to go off to the Caribbean or whatever. You can go off to the Isle of Wight and it counts as a separate island. And it's gone from being a few people meeting on a net to being a mainstream activity. Each operation makes a few thousand contacts probably. And the IOTA contest, which I manage, that's out of date. We had over 2,000 entries this year. Again, did a small radio CP licensing, CPT licensing, making it so much easier. Those pictures, this is a trip Martin, the G3ZAY and I did to the Farne Islands, up off the Northumberland coast. Here we were sitting out in the sunshine, working the island chasers. And this one was actually on St Kilda, up off the Scottish coast. Still quite a rare one for islands on the air. A little bit about operating. If you want to know about operating, it's a very good operating manual that the RSGB publishes. I can say that because I rewrote it a few years ago. Now, follow the DX station's lead. Listen. A lot of people, as we know, come onto the air without or listening experience as they used to in days gone by. But the trick is to listen. What's going on? Oh, there's a rare station there. He's making lots of contacts, and I can't hear the people who are calling him. Why is that? Well, of course, he's listening on a different frequency. Be ready to work split frequency yourself. It's not difficult with modern radios. Maybe use the less common bands or modes. Oh, I'd really like to make contact with this one. I cover these expeditions in my RAGCOM column, and there's newsletters and all sorts of things. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But everybody's got a Yagi for 20, 15 and 10, all the big DXs, but they haven't all got Yagis for 30 meters or 17 meters or 12 meters. So maybe those are the bands you should focus on. Now this latest expedition I was talking about to Glorioso, FT5GA, that's active at the moment, I really wanted that one on 30 meters, and I hadn't actually got a 30 meter antenna in the air. But it's something I've been meaning to try. I bought a couple of these SOTA poles, these things that they sell for summits on the air. The length of them is almost exactly a quarter wave on 30 meters. And I had, from an old Yagi, I had the centre of it. It was about this long, aluminium, and a pole in the middle. And I just stuck a SOTA pole on each end of it, and ran a wire along, and it's up at about 50 feet on one of my towers. So a full-size dipole on 30, and it worked a treat. The first evening that there were a reasonable signal, I managed to work them reasonably quickly. Timing, listen to what's going on, what's the operator at the other end doing. Don't call when he's trying to contact somebody else, all the obvious things, but a lot of people don't seem to find it obvious, they just call and call and call. and listen to DXpeditions and DX stations, what works and what doesn't. We try and set an example when we go on our 5-star expeditions. We have an operating manual and we say this is the way we do it. We identify ourselves no more than every third contact. We do this, we do that, and if you don't subscribe to this, don't come with us. But you will get groups like these that are on Glorioso who are there because they're French military. They're the only people allowed onto the island. They're not experienced DX operators, and they're not doing it that well. They're getting criticised, but frankly, they're the guys who've got permission to go there, and the rest of the world needs to recognise that and fit in with it. Radio propagation, this is what HF is all about. It's what VHF is about, but a lot of that is making your own propagation, particularly on 2 metres and above. But on HF, we're supposed to have an 11-year sunspot cycle. Some of us are wondering what's happened.
What's the sunspot?
It's been very quiet since the last cycle stopped. But there are also daily and seasonal effects. The Italian phenomenon, why do the Italians do so well? Well, partly because they seem to have a special license for high power.
Tiles in their bathroom.
The rumour has it that if you have a big linear, the authorities fine you each year, and that's regarded, but they don't take the kit away, so people just regard that as a sort of equivalent of a high power licence. You pay the annual fine and you keep running your 5 or 10 kilowatts. But seriously, I mean, they do have an advantage being that bit further south on the high bands. It makes a big difference. The MUFs, the maximum usable frequency, would generally be higher. I remember doing a contest once from big contest station in East Anglia, and it was just one of those years where the propagation didn't quite reach us on the high bands, and it was so frustrating to hear the Southern Europeans contacting stuff that we couldn't hear. But there again, conversely, the Scandinavians, you'll hear talking to the Pacific on 80 metres when we don't have a hope in hell. There are solar events that affect things like flares and so on, which affect HF propagation, and particularly if you're sending your signals through the auroral zone, it can make a big difference as to whether the sun is quiet or not. And in fact, one of the benefits of this sunspot, this extended sunspot minimum, is that we haven't had the problems with the auroral zone that we might have at other times. It's always worth looking at predictions. Software has got better over the years. I remember back in the mid to late 80s, I suppose it was, doing a review of various software for the RSGB's HF convention. And I looked at some early antenna modelling software, but also some early propagation prediction software. And it was using a 286 computer and no mass code processor, and these things were just grim. Whereas now they're much, much better and much more sophisticated. They won't just look at both ends of a path, but they look at the intermediate hops and things. There's a lot of computing involved, but with modern Pentium processors and things, it's no big deal.